So one of the topics that we come back to a lot is the limitations of wind and solar and how their intermittency makes them expensive and makes this idea of 100% renewable or anything close to it impossible. But a leading environmentalist and somebody who you quote at length in the moral case for fossil fuels, Alex Amory Lovins, along with one of his colleagues, they have a piece in the New York Times recently where they're claiming the opposite. And I would stress this issue of claim because it's shocking how little they argue for it. So essentially, what they claim is that we can replace all of coal and oil and nuclear and most or a large portion of natural gas and be 100% renewable, mostly from wind and solar, in according to them, in a way that will save us $5 trillion compared to business as usual. And so, I mean, I kind of wish we could go line by line through this thing, but just to give people a sense of how this argues, and then we can talk about some of the problems with it, just to get at this issue of affordability and reliability. So, on the affordability issue, this is more or less the entirety of their argument. They say abundant market data show that a renewably powered future would cost less than our current system. And then they have a link to a study from an organization called Energy Innovation. And Energy Innovation, this is, I mean, it's a super partisan organization. Their mission, they say, is to accelerate progress in clean energy. And if you look at this, it's not it's like a lot of these studies, it doesn't look at the all in actual cost of a grid running on wind and solar because there is no such grid. They just have what are called, I always forget the acronym, the LCOE, levelized costs of energy study, where they claim that renewables,
Electricity, usually, I think it is.
well, I think it's energy, but in this case, they're only looking at electricity, and the the studies don't actually look at the all-in cost, including the need to have life support for wind and solar, and the impact of wind and solar on requiring reliable energy to function inefficiently. So it's not a real apples to apples comparison, but to me, that just that alone, like that is their argument. And it's the equivalent of if we submitted an op-ed that said actually renewables are expensive, and then we linked to the Heritage Foundation or something. Like, nobody would regard that as an acceptable argument, let alone the failure of the underlying data. But then I was really more interested in this reliability point, because you see that affordability point made all the time, but this is their answer to reliability. They say that concerns about round-the-clock availability of electricity from highly renewable grid, a common fear, are mostly misplaced. And I just pause for a second, because that mostly is an interesting word. Like, that means it's not totally misplaced. So I'd love to hear from them what they think is the part that is not misplaced. But then they go on and say that the Department of Energy has assessed that renewables that are commercially available today, combined with a more flexible electric grid, whatever that means, can reliably supply up to 80% of our electricity in 2050. Why not today? That's not clear. And then they mentioned that 4 European countries with virtually no hydro get 46 to 71% of their electricity from renewables. And they never tell us what those countries pay. But if you look at the evidence supplied for this, reliability of wind and solar, uh, they link to a video that they put together that basically says that, well, if we use enough wind and solar and then bounce it with a little bit of dispatchable on demand renewables like geothermal, then we'll be fine. And they suggest that that's what Germany and Denmark and a few other countries in Europe are already largely doing. So I'm definitely interested in anything Stefan has to say, breaking down some of those claims. But to me, it was just striking that these are just completely radical claims, and there's no real evidence that any person could really parse there.
Well, yeah, I want to hear what Stefan has to say as well. But one thing to note about this, so think about if you're at all familiar with the world of startups, startup projections that startups make when they're soliciting investment, or even business projections that businesses are making. It's notorious that businesses will say all kinds of things that are wrong about the future, and it's some combination of, because it's hard to know what the future will be like when you're talking about things that haven't been done. Plus, there are changing conditions, and so that's one thing. I just lost my train of thought. On the other term, in on the other thing, in terms of what makes it difficult to have different kinds of projections of the future, but actually a big part of it is just that. Oh, and then also people just have all sorts of incentives. They're generally incentivized to be overly optimistic about their own technology. So that's just a phenomenon even with private businesses where you have markets and whatnot. And the more speculative the technology, the more dubious the projections. But now we're talking in the realm of government force, where we're just talking about people who are trying to get control of the government, and they're just trying to reassure us, well, if you impose my energy plan, and Levins has been asking this for 45 years, then it'll all be okay. So I think it was in 74, definitely sometime in the 70s, where he said, oh, for what I think he called it a soft technology, but solar and other soft technologies can supply most of our needs pretty soon. And he's saying that in the 70s. And the thing is that what you would actually need to figure out to make something work is not something that they're even remotely capable of doing. That no one is really capable of doing when you're dealing with very, very speculative technologies. So when I hear what Don is saying, it's just these guys aren't even really trying. They're being so sloppy. They're not looking at the all-in cost, as you mentioned. They're just finding, oh yeah, some study says this, and yet they're asking for life and death power over people's lives by controlling the energy supply, or in this case, I think destroying the energy supply. And there's just something that has to shift in terms of how we perceive people who make these claims about, oh, my energy alternative can do this, or my plan can do this. It's like when the Chinese and the Soviets had 5-year plans. There's something about, you have to realize this is not a real plan. There's very much a guilty till proven innocent attitude that we should have toward this kind of thing. And the number one thing we should say is prove it. Prove it on any scale before demanding the right to impose it on every scale. Stefan, any thoughts that you have?
Yeah, one particularly interesting argument that was mentioned by Lovins as a justification for how all this renewable business works without actual storage was that, okay, we can just produce solar and wind in some area of the United States when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining in another part of the United States. And that's an interesting theory, but we are running the live experiment, and probably many people have already heard about this. There's something called the dark doldrums in Central Europe almost every year towards winter season, and what that means is that solar isn't producing much because of the weather, and at the same time, wind isn't producing a lot, and that happens. Not every year, but it happens often enough so that it's relevant. And this weather condition then keeps or is alive over several days, often over all of Central Europe. So the entire region doesn't get any juice from solar and wind. And so it's not true that you can then just transfer from one area to the next area and you're good. And even if it would actually work, let's say, there's a region in the United States where this would actually work, think about the amount of overproduction you would need in all areas, so that every time one area falls flat for 80% of its capacity, or 75, or whatever they are planning for, and the others have to compensate for that. And this dead capital then, for the rest of the year just stands around. So this kind of extreme event, like the dark doldrums in Central Europe, this is driving up the costs then of the system. And so it has been mentioned many times and analyzed many times, and we are running the live experiment. And every year we are seeing this bottleneck of capacity where we have to reactivate old coal power plants and additional capacity from foreign countries and so on in Germany. So it's not like we don't have empirical experience with this, and it's not going to work.
Yeah, I keep coming back to this idea that we're allowing too, just as a society, we're allowing way too much of people able to just make up things, or to put it colloquially, pull things out of their asses, and then say, "Oh, well, here's why it won't work, and here's why it won't work, and here's why it won't work." And notice that in other areas of life, you don't have to do this. Even a situation where, say, Microsoft, an amazingly potent company, said, "Oh, we're going to have a competitor to the iPod." So that doesn't seem like that's a lot easier in a sense than creating uh, a totally unprecedented form of power using primarily unreliable fuels, which nobody has done at all. Like that seems a lot harder than creating a decent competitor to an iPod. And yet with the Zune, people acknowledge, oh yeah, Microsoft completely failed at it. They just did not succeed at all. And yet, and in general, we don't have to pay for that. I mean, if you're a stockholder in Microsoft, then you have to pay for that mistake. But hopefully then the knowledge that they got there may apply somewhere else. But as a and maybe as an early adopting customer, you were optimistic, and in that sense you have to pay. But basically, people's bad ideas do not cost you because they're not imposed upon you. And this is a great idea of Ayn Rand's, which she talks about the separation of state and economics. And the idea is somebody else can have all sorts of ideas about how to organize the economy, but they can't impose them on you. You're free to interact with the people that that are actually doing something that's valuable to you. So what we have in energy is we have this idea that you're allowed to force your economic ideas on everyone, since we need to protect ourselves from climate change, allegedly. So that just becomes this license to impose any crackpot idea on the whole population. But given how important energy is to human life, we need really, really high bars of this technology is proven before it is even considered as a significant replacement. So even with nuclear, there's so much to work out in terms of it being a mass replacement, but let alone the unreliables. So this is something I'm going to think about more, and also address at least somewhat in the next version of Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, because it's a big problem that these crackpot ideas are treated as innocent until proven guilty, and then that they can just be imposed upon us by force, and then we're just at the mercy of them, just like the Soviets were at the mercy of Lysenko's really bad genetic ideas. Whereas in a free society, he just would have had a failing farm, and his investors, or he might not have even gotten investors, but a very small percentage of people would have paid the price by choice, instead of everyone paying the price not by choice.